Welcome to Two Fools for Christ. Today we will be discussing the good, the bad, and the ugly of ride shopping.
So for this video, the way we're going to be considering rite shopping is whenever you attend a rite that isn't your own rite by baptism. So whether that's going to a different parish or liturgical rite regularly, or having a longer period of time where you attend another rite and become really immersed into it before coming back to your own rite, we're going to discuss our personal experience, the positives we got out of it, the negative stuff it can bring around, and then the ugly element that can immerse when it gets really disbalanced. So, to start with the good, I see a lot personally. I see a lot of benefit in attending different rites. I see that when you attend different rites, it gives you a broader sense of knowledge in terms of the faith, and it can dispel certain attachments to people's own right. So I find that when if a person only has ever attended their own rite and they begin to branch and to see other forms of Catholicism, they can have a sense of treating another liturgical rite as though it's alien to what the Catholic tradition is. So rather than embracing the universality and the diversity of traditions in our church, it can often come with a sense of, well, this is not how it ought to be. So if you're too fixated and narrow minded in a particular rite, what ends up emerging over time, I think, is a sense that your particular form of liturgical expression is the universal expression of how liturgy is supposed to be done. And so I would say, just to start the conversation off, the first and probably best aspect about liturgical rite shopping is to actually experience and to come to a genuine realization that the Catholic faith is about a unity in faith, but a diversity in tradition.
I would definitely agree with your first point, and I'd even take it further in a sense, maybe not using the exact term of ride shopping to speak about this instance, which I'm going to speak about, but saying it's actually almost a necessity that someone of an Eastern rite, for example, like us, we're Maronites, should experience at least once the community of another rite. And when I say another rite, mainly I'm talking about the Western rite, so the Roman rite, especially if they live in a country that's multicultural, whether it's the United States, the UK, Australia. And why I say this is because I think we can both say that as Maronites, we may have a tendency to be very enclosed in our community, even beyond things that are liturgical. And so when you have that cultural element that's predominant in our own culture, which is very closely linked to our rite, what you might see is the same thing replicated in friendship groups or community groups when they interact with cultures, which is that they tend to be a bit standoffish. And so what you said, which is that what you said earlier, sorry, is that you might be thinking that because you've only experienced a certain expression of the liturgy within the context of the Maronite rite, then when you do witness the Roman rite or the Byzantine rite or anything that may be slightly different, you're turned off, not in a sense of preference, but you're turned off in the sense of this isn't how it ought to be done. And that's not necessarily a good attitude. And that can be exemplified in really extreme and bad cases where you begin to then hate that other group, and it creates almost a semi-orthodox view within the Catholic Church. And so that's not a good thing. So I think that at the very least, experiencing other rites allows you to really be embodied in the reality of being part of the mystical body of Christ. Body parts are different, but we're all effectively still within that same body. And so I think the benefit I've had, at least, in the experience of seeing and witnessing the expression of the Catholic faith, really, in all its forms, not just liturgically, in the West, has allowed me to actually see that. And it's a beautiful thing. It actually shapes your culture in a much more holistic way.
Yeah, so I would say so to pick up on a couple of those points, I would agree with you. If you are a Catholic of a minority rite in the diocese you're in, then it's even of more value. So, if, for example, if you're an Eastern Rite Catholic in what is a traditionally Western Rite diocese, so whether you're in America, Australia, England, then it makes even more sense for you to attend, because most of the Catholics you're going to meet are going to be of a different liturgical expression, a different theological expression. So it's good to understand that. And I would say that, for example, if you're a Roman Rite, I mean, obviously this is a smaller percentage of people, but if you're a Roman Rite in a predominantly Eastern Rite country, for example, I don't know, if you were in Eastern Europe, if you were in the Holy Land, then likewise, it would be even more beneficial, because you stand to gain more by understanding the liturgical expression of the dominant rite that you're in. Because if we truly believe the phrase lex orandi, lex credendi, the rule of prayer is the rule of faith, then without falling into any fake idea that there are like deeply different theological understandings in East and West, but just on the idea that there are different theological emphases, different way of expressing things, then by attending and having an experience of the other liturgies, you're better able to understand the manner in which they express themselves. So that was the first thing I wanted to discuss. And then also the whole idea that you brought up of the way that certain countries or people from particular countries can come off as standoffish. There is something to that as well. I've always viewed it in a similar way. Just like a man who has visited the world and seen other countries is said to be of a, and this has negative connotations today, to call somebody open-minded, because it tends to mean that they don't have conviction. But in a truer sense, the classical sense of when a person was isolated in their own particular village, they think that their way of doing everything is the only way, and that if they meet people, foreigners, so to speak, then all of a sudden they appear very alien. I do think there's a genuine parallel there. Just like a man gains some type of cultural uh, knowledge and a greater sense of character because he's immersed himself in other cultures and has met, you know, people from different cultures and knows how to interact with them in their own manner, then likewise, I would say there's a similar benefit here liturgically, because you can come off as very ignorant and closed-minded when you speak on liturgy if you haven't actually seen other liturgies. And this is going to feed into the next point I want to make, which is um, attending other rites will dispel any ahistorical attachments to later developed forms of pious expression. So, what do I mean by that? Um, there are there are ways in which we express adoration or devotion in the liturgies, which develop according to the particular culture of the rite that of a particular liturgy, and sometimes this can lead into an overemphasis of what are ultimately accidental qualities of worship. So there is actual worship. So prayer is the elevation of the intellect and will to God. And then there are the accidental aspects of the physical postures we assume while we do that. And those physical postures are important. And it's now we talked about this in our discussion about the spiritual life. You know, a denial of use of prayer postures as being important in prayer is not an ideal thing, but they are ultimately accidental. And so, you know, hanging around people of different liturgical rites and hanging around, for example, Latin Mass, having a lot of Latin Mass friends, they can sometimes fall, some of them, into this belief that, you know, it is in itself per se better to, for example, kneel when receiving communion. Now, though I love the practice and it's appropriate to do so in the West, where that's the patrimony of the rite, you know, you realize that it isn't a real fair criticism of the novice order as to say, you know, receiving communion standing has resulted in a lack of, you know, belief in the real presence, when we see that historically for 2000 years the entirety of the Eastern rites have always received and have presented themselves before our Lord standing, because that was the cultural attitude of respect towards a king is to rise and to stand in his presence, and um, there is no crisis of the real presence in those rites. And so I would say that it definitely can heal certain liturgical misconceptions that are quite prevalent today, and help you have a broader and more true and historical perspective of, what actually makes a good liturgy, what are causing certain liturgical problems today, and to avoid some of those extremes that you can only arrive to if you're just simply immersed in, you know the battles between the 1962 and the 1969 missile. Only if you're completely immersed in that context and oblivious to the other rights could you arrive to some of those conclusions.
Yeah, I definitely want to speak to the last point that you just mentioned now, because this is why I think there's actually a major benefit, even in countries that are majority, Western Rite, Roman Rite, to actually experience the minority rites, the Eastern rites, because what ends up happening is when you're embodied in that one culture, that one liturgical expression of the liturgy, what happens is quite literally what you just related with respect to the standing and kneeling on reception of communion, which isn't really a matter of piety. It's a matter of cultural and liturgical preference and traditional development. It's like you said, in the East, we stand for a king. But in the West, it's always been genuflecting, kneeling for the king. Understanding that difference easily dispels the myths that come about saying that standing is objectively inferior and it is objectively superior to kneel when receiving communion. There are other elements of receiving communion that are common and universal. One might argue that in the current context, reception of the tongue is objectively superior to reception of the hand, for example, as a valid form of receiving the Eucharist. But all rites could agree receiving on the tongue will easily help quell any abuses, for example, of receiving communion, such as stealing the host, dropping the host, dirtying the host, whatever it may be. That's something we can universally agree on amongst all rites. But something like standing and kneeling, there's cultural nuance that has to be implemented there. But when you've only been used to one rite, which is liturgical expression, focuses entirely, especially when you, like you said, going back to the traditional Latin Mass community, on kneeling, for example, it's hard to see the other rites practice as being valid, especially if you haven't experienced their liturgy to see how it's done and how it's done reverently. But also, if you just haven't experienced the liturgy at all, or no, what tends to happen is when you hear about them. So I think the experience actually has to be practical. It can't just be theoretical. It's not just a knowing of their existence. Because what tends to happen is, and we see this especially online, though things online aren't necessarily a reflection of what happens on the ground, though I think there's a point still to be made here, is you find that there tends to be animosity developed, or the other rights are looked on as the stupid little brother almost. And this can go both ways. The little brother sometimes can have resentment to the older brother and so on, but it's ultimately not a good thing. Again, going back to that point where part of the mystical body of Christ, we're meant to be united in things, and our differences should be beautiful expressions of culture and liturgy in different forms. That's how it clearly was intended. That's why we have the beauty of different rights. They shouldn't be suppressed or mocked in ways which is totally undue.
Yeah, so onto the little and older brother stuff. From my personal experience, at least, um, the Roman Rite Catholics, especially the Latin Mass crowd, tend to be pretty open and positive about the Eastern liturgical rites as rites in themselves. So I've never really experienced hostility from those people individually. I think what can happen though is that they begin to treat, and this is actually something that both Easterners use to their own advantage. Sometimes we use this as a get out of jail free card, and Westerners use as an excuse to just not have to deal with the fact that we're different. Is, oh, it's okay because you're Eastern. So, for example, you're having a conversation about Because when you have a discussion in the church, you should always have a holistic perspective on any topic you're talking about. You can't have just an easy get out of free exception clause, which is, you know, you should kneel because it's Jesus and the Eucharist, and if you're not kneeling, that's bad, and you don't show him as much love. Oh, but in the East we stand. Oh, but that's okay because you're Eastern and that's your cultural heritage. It's not, I find that it isn't so much the animosity, it's almost just to treat it like a novelty. We're just the exception or the novelty that kind of breaks the standard in which they kind of have their liturgical paradigm that they've formed, which has internal coherence if you're just considering the Roman rite, but falls apart the moment you bring in other liturgical rites. So the
So
only way they can
it's
reconcile,
basically then what you're saying is just sorry, just to jump in quickly, is
yeah,
them treating it as the exception to the rule as opposed to a different rule within that Catholic context.
yeah. So rather than having a liturgical framework that can take in all these factors simultaneously, it's kind of all working coherently within just the Roman rite. And whenever the Eastern rites can contradict certain of those more determined statements, like for example, the receiving on the kneeling is, you know, obviously, um, just by somehow human reason, more fitting if it's the true real presence is true. Somehow that is absolutely true in the TLM versus novice order debates. But the moment the Eastern Catholics get brought up, then they don't have animosity towards us, which is great. I mean, we don't want them to, and they will respect us. And there is a deference to the fact that we have a different cultural patrimony, which is why we do it. But they haven't like in their liturgical theories, have not factored in a coherent understanding of that. It's just like, oh, they're just over there, and they're allowed to do things the way they want to do it because we want unity and we allow for difference for the sake of unity, but really ideally it should ought to be done in this way, but we're just going to tolerate it for the sake of unity. It can kind of fall into one, treating the Eastern rites as though they're just kind of the younger dumber brother who will eventually wake up and learn to do things the proper way. That's one attitude. The other attitude, which I think is more prevalent, which is just, again, it more comes from ignorance. They're talking liturgically just within a internal framework of the Roman Rite. It's the Roman Rite liturgical debates, and because they're not liturgists, they're just young people who tend to have high, like really opinionated perspectives on liturgy. They don't actually incorporate it all. And that's the whole point of attending other rites, because the moment you attend other rites, you're going to have an experiential knowledge of, okay, well, actually standing for communion does not necessarily result in the problems that can occur in Eucharistic devotion in the novice order. There is not a correlation there in itself. And so I've always found that the TLM goers who are genuine liturgists, who actually study the other liturgies, who have attended the Eastern rites, just they avoid the bad arguments. That's all I'm saying. They just have a better understanding of liturgy because they understand what are the universal principles of liturgy and what are the particular principles that are associated with each rite. And because they can distinguish those things, because they've attended or slash studied other rites, they can have a more robust liturgical theology that can actually guide a genuine reform in the Roman Rite. So I would even say that just from rebuilding the Roman Rite liturgically, the people who are doing it the best are the people who actually have attended other rites. So I would just say that there is plenty to gain from an Easterner attending Western rites and from a Westerner attending Eastern rites. It goes both way because knowledge will just broaden both sides' perspectives.
I think it's also interesting because this can easily bleed into the negatives. But before that, I do have another point for
Sure.
the positives that I wanted to quickly mention, which is I think that, and this isn't strictly to do with right shopping. It can be applied in other circumstances, such as just changing it from a Novus Ordo parish to a traditional Latin Mass parish.
Yeah.
But specifically within the context of right shopping, I think when for someone who's living in a situation where the parishes proximate to themselves in a certain rite are either committing, I, I'm reluctant to say committing, rather celebrating the liturgy in a way that is scandalous or very irreverent, which is negatively impacting their own spiritual life. The other rites may provide them with more certainty in the faith of the Catholic Church, in the sense that the
Yeah.
liturgy, being the highest point of our spiritual lives, is a reflection of what we believe on. In all honesty, someone who's celebrating the liturgy reverently, we know by virtue of that fact that they believe the Catholic faith and that they desire to have a good and rightly ordered relationship with God. Since that is the peak and the pinnacle of the spiritual life, it would make sense how that would be a reflection. There are exceptions to the rule, of course. Just because someone celebrates a traditional Latin Mass, that does not necessarily mean that they are some perfect, holy person. But it tends to be a rule that, though it has exceptions, it still stands. And now, with respect to ride shopping, this might provide some harbor for those people who have experience with parishes which may not celebrate the liturgy that well, and so going to another rite, the Byzantine rite, the Maronite rite, or vice versa
Mm.
with the Roman rite visiting to the Eastern rites, may provide that safety. Now, this can again bleed into the negatives, but I think that
Yeah,
is
I was
in
gonna
itself
say it really
a
can.
positive that we see in America as well. For example, with many Americans finding harbor, especially in the 20, 30 years ago, before some of the more traditional revival, going to going to those rites.
I would, yeah, this is definitely something I want to come back to in the negatives because there is a there is an element there that can definitely go bad or sour. But I think overall I agree in that I think maybe rather than that point might more be like just generally parish shopping can be a sometimes a moral necessity today as much as we would all want to support our local parish the way it traditionally used to be done, especially if you have children. um, Edifying your spiritual life, edifying their spiritual life and their formation is more important. So if you're going to have to move them because the homilies are terrible or the liturgy is not it's instilling a sense of reverence, then I think that's perfectly legitimate. But like you said, that can apply within one's own right, attending another parish within one's own right, or going outside of one's own right to achieve that. Um, there's one more thing about the good that I wanted to bring up, and this to me is one like it's what I would say is there are different emphases in the liturgies. So um, in the new rite, they in the 1969 missal of the Roman Rite, they introduced this like the proclamation of the Paschal mystery, the Mysteri Fidei. We proclaim your death, O Lord. We profess your resurrection, and we await your second coming. And so, um, the liturgy can kind of be distilled down into those three mysteries. So, what is the Mass about? Many people would say it's the sacrifice of the Eucharist, which is true. It is, but like the Mass itself tells us, is not just solely the sacrifice of Calvary, re-present on the altar. It's also the life, death, resurrection, and second coming of our Lord. And that's the mystery in its total. And I would argue, at least, that even though I think this needs to be people need to be a bit more careful with the way they express this, because these elements are present in all the rites of the church. Sometimes I hear people, especially Orthodox, will say like the mass is about a sacrifice, but in the East, the mass or the liturgy, the divine liturgy, is about the resurrection of our Lord. And I think that's a very ignorant statement because it isn't those things don't compete. Again, the true expression is that it's the death, resurrection, and second coming of our Lord. It's all three elements. But what I do think is true, and I would say that this applies not just liturgically, but even theologically, when we talk about theological and liturgical differences between the East and the West, and even, between Eastern rites, because oftentimes we distill the entirety of the East as though it's one tradition to be compared to with the West. But that's not true. You've got the Syriac, the Alexandrian, and the Byzantine rites, which also between them have different liturgical emphases. And I think and theological emphasis as well. That's why we speak in the early church of the Antiochian school, the Alexandrian school, and so many debates theologically and controversies arose out of differences between different Eastern Christians that eventually drew Rome into having to settle. But perfect example of this, I would say, would be, and from my own experience, the Western liturgy, especially the 1962 Missal, and I don't want to play too much into the whole Novus Ordo versus the 69 versus the 62 Missal question, but the first time I personally really felt, experientially at least, that the Mass was a sacrifice was at the first Latin Mass I attended. I mean, I grew up well catechized, so I always knew that the Mass was a sacrifice. But seeing the form, the way that the priest moved about the altar, genuflected, offered incense in a particular form, expressed the mystery of the sacrifice in a way that kind of hit me like an epiphany, just like a realization. Oh, wow, this is a sacrifice. Now, in the Maronite rite, we have very specific prayers that call the liturgy a sacrifice. So this isn't to say, oh, in the West it's a sacrifice, in the East it's not. But what I will say is that liturgical forms give a different experience of what mysteries are being emphasized. And this kind of goes back to the whole standing, kneeling, genuflecting question. If you look at the Lausanne's 54 Missal, at the front, I think it has a bit of catechesis, and it talks about the priest genuflecting a lot in the Roman rite, so the rite of Rome. And it mentioned, and this is probably just a pious perspective, that every genuflection a priest makes in the Roman rite, the reason why there are so many is because he's making, each time he does so, he makes reparations for the insults of our Lord during his passion. Now, I've also served the Dominican rite. So the Dominican rite is also a Western liturgy. But the Dominican rite, the priest only genuflects on the way in and on the way out twice throughout the entirety of the liturgy. Otherwise, he bows. He bows when he passes the tabernacle. He bows before he does things. He'll genuflect, yes, after the consecration. He genuflects and then elevates, then genuflects. So there would be in total 6 genuflections, as opposed to the Roman rite, in which case every time he passes the tabernacle, he genuflects. So that's another example of just having liturgical variation within the Western tradition itself will teach you that there are different emphases, different practices between the rites. And in the Eastern rites, they've always maintained the practice of standing. So why do they stand? Well, again, that's a cultural thing. That's just a way of giving respect to God through the mode of standing. But there's this particular point in which when the Lord, like in the Maronite rite, the first time after the Eucharistic prayer is completed, and the first time that the rubrics, at least, I mean, some priests do different things, but when the rubrics require the priest to elevate the chalice and the host after having done the institution, the prayer of institution, and the epiclesis, that is the point in which the entire congregation goes from sitting and rising all at once to stand because the Lord, their King, has made himself present now in the liturgy. He's been presented as a form of monstrance in the priest's hand, and so they rise and they stand, and that's supposed to signify the rising at the second coming, because when our Lord appears in his greatness at the second coming, all the buried Christians will rise facing the east. And that's exactly what happens at that point in the liturgy. And so while the West will genuflect, at least in the Roman Rite, to make reparation to our Lord and his insults, in the Maronite Rite, we will rise in signification of our Lord's second coming, because he's being presented to us in the flesh in the liturgy. And so, does the West not have the ascension as a mystery in its liturgy? Of course it does. It's not about that. It's about there are different points of emphasis that sometimes we come to a realization of when we experience it in the liturgy. Maybe for the first time in attending an Eastern Rite, you'll have that. Just like for the first time I attended a Latin Mass, my first impression by the time we got to the Eucharistic prayer was, he looks like this is going to sound bad, but this is genuinely what came to my head. It's like, this is almost like a pagan priest offering sacrifice at an altar, which sounds really bad, but it was just genuinely the first time that a sacrifice, it actually looked like a sacrifice. Like there was a sacrifice on an altar and a priest offering incense to it. And so that can happen when you attend other rites and expose yourself to the different mysteries and the way they're emphasized there.
I think especially with the tone of the liturgy, I actually haven't thought about that aspect before. But looking back, now that you mentioned that, it makes a lot of sense when you think about, again, both all elements of Christ's ministry are present in the liturgy. His life, death, and resurrection. It's not as if the East prefers one over the other or the West prefers one of the over the other. It's all in sync. But if you look at the tone of a Maronite liturgy, at least in our own experience, I know in my experience, it's almost as if there's a lot more joy, and not in the sense that
That's
there's no joy in the
controversial.
Roman, right? But in the sense that there's joy in the resurrection. Whereas in the Roman rite, it's pointing out the traditional Latin Mass is actually a very good point, because it seems almost like the entire thing's a funeral. It's very solemn and it's very silent. So that's a very good point. I haven't thought about that before. I don't have much to say necessarily about this entire part of the discussion, only because I'm not too sure. Like you went into a little bit about the actual differences with respect to the resurrection and with respect to the Paschal Lamb sacrifice, emphasizing it in the West and emphasizing the East. I'm just not sure where it actually started and how that actually goes about showing a tangible difference. But maybe you can go into that a little bit more if you wanted to.
Well, I mean, Father Cassian Folsom, the prior, the abbot of the Benedictines in Norcia, he does talk a little bit about this. The term Paschal mystery, according to him at least, from if I'm remembering what he said correctly, is a term that began to originate in kind of the liturgical revival of the 20th century. And it's a little bit of an innovation in that particular form. Like the Paschal mystery is not really a term supposedly that the fathers use. Um, but yeah, I don't know if there's too much more to speak of, except for the fact that I would definitely want people to avoid the easy point scoring. Like sometimes people, when they want to overplay the differences in the rights, they'll talk about this as being an actual difference, like as though, like you said, just because the Roman rite may often feel very penitential, doesn't mean that it denies the other elements of the Paschal mystery. And just because the East might have more chant, like for example in the West, um, more is done in quiet. In the East, the way that the chanting can occur between the priest and the laity is a continuous ebb and flow of a build up. And again, that just creates a different feeling. And feelings don't actually mean theological differences. Um, but this also does play into the question of there was a greater, like the liturgical revisionists, not revisionists, the liturgical reformers, some would call them revisionists, of the 20th of the 20th century, definitely did try to play into um, making the mass like, I don't want to say less sacrificial, but there was a conscious effort from them to reincorporate a greater emphasis of the other parts of the Paschal mystery, and in so doing have been accused by adherents of the old 62 Missal of denying the sacrificial nature. Now, that's not true, and maybe there is something to be said about the 62 Missal. um, I don't know. I don't really buy it. I just don't buy that narrative. So I don't know. The way I look at it is, if there's any sense in your own spiritual life in where you haven't felt as though the liturgy is a commemoration of the resurrection, then maybe just attend an Eastern rite and see how that feels. And then if you're an Easterner who hasn't felt the sense of the sacrifice, go to a Western liturgy. I sometimes, and we'll get to this in the bad stuff, just because you feel something that you haven't noticed before in your own right doesn't mean your own right's not good,
Yeah,
because
that's actually
you're used to it. From an Easterner perspective, they're going to have the hit that had when you go to a Latin Mass for the first time and feel like this is very sacrificial. This is like he's here to proclaim and to represent Calvary in a more explicit way through his actions, as opposed to when I envision a Maronite priest offering the liturgy, because there isn't as much genuflecting, there isn't much of that stuff. The priest is often standing. Our vestments traditionally are often white and always white. The priest is, there's more standing. There is this kind of proclamation of glory. And this is just an experiential thing. This is how I perceive the liturgies. This isn't an objective thing, but I just do perceive my experience in the Maronite rite as often being an expression of the glory of Christ manifested on this earth. And when I go to a Latin Mass, I feel, again, because this is a subjective perspective and other people might not have it, that I am there for a solemn sacrifice. And both are true. And sometimes in my own particular spiritual life, I need the other thing. If I've been going to the Maronite rite very frequently, um, sometimes a part of me will crave the Latin Mass and I'll go back to it. And there's a part of our soul that needs both, and both is present in both liturgies, but you might get a bit of a higher dose if you go to one over the other.
Yeah, see that it's interesting because when we're going to be speaking about the negatives, there might be a little bit of disagreement because we have slightly maybe different views or different practices, at least with respect to ride shopping, so to speak. But I'm just not sure how concrete that necessarily is. Your last point of maybe, like, having that craving and that necessarily even being an ordered thing, because I think, at least in my experience, I can definitely see what you're talking about. I can definitely see that aspect of there being more of a solemn silent tone in the Latin Mass. That's clear. And in the Maronite liturgies, there tends to be a lot more joy in the resurrection arising. It's almost like a masculine aggression in the Maronite rite, in the joy of that resurrection, proclaiming the gospel when you leave. But I think if as a Maronite attending Maronite liturgy, you feel as though there is a lack of, and again, I emphasize feel because, like you said, that's not a reflection of the theological leanings or views or beliefs or expressions of that liturgy. If you feel there's a lacking element of that sacrifice, then maybe it's a calling not for you to visit the other rite, but it's actually a calling for you to study Christ's sacrifice more. There's a real sense in which I think once you have studied something theologically, read certain spiritual works, that is going to be put at the forefront of your mind, and then you will see the beauty and the expression of that belief, of that aspect of Christ's life in the liturgy. And so I think that's probably more so a calling to study than it is to visit other rites. But I definitely see on the other hand that rite shopping will have the benefit of, without study, showing that a bit more clearly, maybe, or easily, as opposed. Not everyone's really going to pick up a work of theology or a spiritual work,
Yeah.
but that's probably what ought to be done, instead of, I can't find this here, so maybe I should go to a different patrimony and experience it,
I
because
would
that then,
agree with that.
yeah, it creates a bad relationship, I think. Then,
Yeah, it does. And that's why it's in the negative. That's why I will want to expound on this in the negative. But I guess what I wanted to just to say that um, if you look for it, you will find it in every rite. In fact, I was like the last liturgy I went to, uh, the Maronite rite. I was reading all the prayers around the Eucharistic prayer. And there is a lot of mention of sacrifice. There is. There is. It's continual. Anyone who wants to say, at least for our rite, that the Eastern rites don't emphasize the sacrifice in the liturgy is just absurd. Because, and I haven't looked at the prayers, but I think there are more mentions of the word sacrifice in the Maronite rite currently than there might, because I haven't actually looked at this. I'm just going off my general sense of the actual, like, of the number of prayers in the novice order. Maybe I just have to, I might have to study that, because there is a lot of mention of it, I would say. And so, yeah, look for it and don't go for it because somehow your rite is lacking. It's not. And that's a really dangerous thing to fall into. But there is a, because you, realistically, most people learn through the liturgy they attend, and people aren't super reflective, even though they ought to be, of what is being said. You know, people aren't skimming the missal and reading everything. They're kind of just there going through the motions. The general impression can often leave a greater change in perspective than just meticulously studying the words. So I would agree with you. You shouldn't be going to another rite because you think that there's something lacking in your rite. That's the first part. If you look in each rite, all the elements of the mystery are present very clearly, undeniably so. I would just say that there is just an impression left by the external expression that reflects, I would argue, different aspects of the mysteries in different ways in different rites. And this goes beyond just the Paschal mystery. I would even, this goes to like towards a difference, I would say, between the Byzantine rite and the Syriac tradition around Christ. Um, for example, and this is to broaden the horizon, and so that people can see that this applies between Eastern rites as well. Um, like the Trisagion, so the what we call the Kadishat, Holy God, Holy Mighty One, Holy Immortal One, have mercy on us and on the whole world. That prayer is universal to all the rites of the church. And we know it's universal to all the rites of the church because it's present in the most ancient Roman rite liturgy we have today, which is Good Friday. The Holy Week liturgies, especially before the reforms of the 54 Missal by Bernini, were the most ancient of all the Roman Rite liturgies, such that when you prayed the breviary of Holy Week, there was no Deus in adjutorium meum intende, there was no Gloria Patri. You just go straight into the Psalms. I mean, Father Cassian Folsom talks about this. And so all the later embellishments of the Roman Rite are just stripped away for Holy Week. And the priests are praying the most ancient rite. And the priests that used to pray this, because I know one Dominican priest who grew up praying this, are very attached to that because it added such variation to their spiritual life when they got to it. But the point I'm making is that the Roman Rite has it in the Good Friday liturgy, which tells us that it's very ancient and potentially more prevalent in the older rite of the Roman Rite, and maybe it just fell off from the weekly liturgy. We don't know. But the Holy God, Holy Mighty One, Holy Immortal One, have mercy on us on the whole world, reveals a difference in emphasis between the Byzantine rite and the Maronite rite, or the Syriac tradition. Because in the Greek Byzantine rite, there is, because a lot of the heresies they had to deal with were in relation to the Trinity. At the end of the day, it was the Cappadocian fathers who were the staunch defenders of the Trinity. And so the Syriacs, we have an addendum. We have like a thing that we add to the Kadishat, depending on the liturgical season. And if you think about it, Jordan, that's always Christological. So we just came through Christmas, and the prayer is, Holy God, Holy Mighty One, Holy Immortal One, have mercy on us and on the whole world. We'll sing that in Syriac, and then we end it with a reference to David being born from Bethlehem. We have a reference of Christ being a descendant of David born in Bethlehem. And the Greeks were like, why are you guys referencing Christ? The Trisagion is supposed to be a Trinitarian prayer. It's supposed to, the Holy God, Holy Mighty One, Holy Immortal, there's three. It's supposed to signify the Trinity. They took issue because in the Syriac tradition, we have a tendency, and this is, again, a matter, and people need to understand this if they want a better approach to different theological traditions. This isn't to say that somehow there's a deep theological difference, but in the Syriac tradition, we have a greater Christological emphasis of the way we interpret our prayers and psalms and typological readings. That the Byzantine Greek East tends to read more Trinitarian. It isn't that we deny the Trinity or they deny the Christological aspect of all the Psalms. It's just that we have that emphasis. So when we approach the Trisagion and we have it in our liturgical seasons, depending on whether it's Easter, whether it's Christmas, we make a final reference towards Christ. And so, again, a liturgical difference, that you wouldn't have a different emphasis unless you attended the different rite. Now, those are differences in emphasis. So it doesn't just apply East and West, it applies between all the liturgical traditions, because when you dig deep into them, they all have different theological emphasis that seep or bleed into their liturgical emphasis. Because, there's nothing really more to add to that point, except for the fact that just like it applies to the Paschal Mystery, it can sometimes even apply towards Christ, the Trinity. I mean, if you think about the Byzantine rite, the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, there are more prayers to Our Lady in the propers of the Mass. So in other words, the parts of the Mass that are the same every week than there are in any Roman Rite liturgy. In the Roman Rite liturgy, you have intercessions for Our Lady. She's listed among the saints in litanies around the Eucharistic prayer. There are no prayers directly towards Our Lady in the propers of the Mass.
That's actually a really good point, yeah. That's actually a very good point. I didn't think
you can have a Mass commemorating Our Lady, like in the Latin Mass, they often did Saturday, what do you call them when you don't have a Mass particular to that feast, so you can pray any? I can't remember what it's called, but you could make a Marian Mass by having all the sorry, did I call them propers? I think it's the commons. I'm mixing it up now. But you could choose an antiphon for Our Lady and have a reading associated. You could construct a Roman liturgy for a particular day that's very Marian. But if you
it's not standard. It's not standard.
Yeah, if you look at the stock standard Byzantine Rite, they shout mid-liturgy to the Theotokos to save them. And there are multiple direct intercessions to Our Lady. What's one of the prayer? I think they say, like, firstly, we commemorate the most glorious, blessed, and holy Theotokos, the ever Virgin Mary. Let us commend ourselves and each other and all our lives unto Christ our God. Like, they have a prayer which is just fully, just directly, multiple times. They pray it like twice throughout the liturgy. in the lead up. So these are things you pick up and
Even the
emphasize.
hymns, actually, even the hymns in the Maronite rite, when they bring a big icon of Our Lady and the Ya Allah will start playing, and that's a part of the liturgy. There's a process by which you bow at certain times, you do the sign of the cross at a certain time when that's being done. The Roman rite doesn't to my memory, have anything
Well,
really
you could
like
say
that
they
at
do
all.
the Salve Regina at the end. It's kind of
That's
this,
true.
like
That's
it's
true. That's
the
true. Yeah,
optional extra. We start the liturgy, they kind of end it. But
yeah.
like,
That's a good parallel. Yeah.
but again, like it's just that difference of emphasis. Like you think of the Maronite incense prayer. And this is the last example I give. But there's a prayer we pray. So in the East, there's a tradition. After 40 days, somebody has passed. You pray a liturgy. You have a liturgy to commemorate the 40 days. And this is a very ancient church practice, which also signifies to all the Protestants that there was an early Christian belief that even though you've buried somebody and done a funeral mass, there is a process, a period of time in which their soul needs assistance. And traditionally, that would be done after 40 days. And we have a hymn. So it's an incense prayer that we pray at the end of any liturgy that's commemorating the death of somebody. And in that hymn, it ends with this long exposition on death, the sting of death, how um, how Isaac would have felt at the death of Abraham, and then it ends with this reference. It says, "Oh, there is this boat, and with a light on it, or something, and that boat is Our Lady, and that light is Christ." And again, that's kind of the Syriac tradition of always bringing back somehow everything to a typological, Christological reading. And if you attend that liturgy, you can get an insight into the theological orientation of that particular rite. It's not a difference in strict belief, but you just expose yourselves to these differences and can appreciate the beauty. And there's a genuine excitement. I mean, if you love liturgy, if you're a Latin Mass goer who likes liturgies because you get really excited about the particulars that priests do and all the symbolism, then to me, attending other rites is the ultimate form of that, because you will see how they all have different ways of expressing the same good, the same truth, the same beauty. And you start to kind of piece together the patrimonies of the different rites of the church. So that's all I have for the goods, personally.
Yeah. No. Like I said before, I think I don't think there's necessarily much we can say more to this topic, especially personally. But I think you expanded a lot on the context of it, and I agree. I just think, of course, naturally, just reiterating that point that this all doesn't mean you have to attend another rite. It shows the beauty of the differences, but it doesn't necessitate one having to go to another rite to experience them. But I think we'd want to move into the negatives now. Do you want to start off the first point you think is a negative about rite shopping?
Yeah. So the first, I would say, is, and I'm guilty of this, is for whatever motivation you want to experience another rite, um, I would say that the two bads is when the rite shopping facilitates a abandonment or a dislike of one's own right. And this is common, I think, in America. We don't really have this here, but a lot of Roman Rite Catholics kind of run to the Eastern Catholics as though that's somehow going to keep them safe from Rome or something. I don't know what they think that's gonna achieve. Um, like that, and then also I would argue when you attend and spiritually benefit from another rite, but you do so in a manner that kind of abandons the obligations towards your own right. So I'll leave it at that. But at this point, I think that we should move, I think, into a discussion of um, the obligations one has towards one right, and why you should always have a preference towards the right you have, no matter how you feel about any other type of liturgy. So I'll drop those and you can take it from here.
Yeah, because I think this is where we'll have, well, we agree, I think, fundamentally on this matter of, like a priest mentioned in a discussion about this to us not too long ago, it really does have something to do with the virtue of patriotism. You love a country because it's where you're from, it's what it gave you what you have. Even if you've moved away from that country, there still ought to be a patriotism, a love of, a loyalty to that country. That this is probably the distinction between that being the specific definition of patriotism and nationalism, but that's obviously not the topic. But it has a reflection in the liturgy, because when it comes to your right, and I mean, I'm guilty of, in a sense, maybe going against this with where I attend my my parish, but the reality is that your right is there to cultivate those traditions and permeate it and sustain it throughout your lineage. It is not a good thing for someone of a certain right, whether it's a Byzantine right, whether it's a Roman right, regardless of the right, to then deviate from that to such an extent that you find that 2 generations down, your children, though perhaps baptized in your respective right, don't have any of that tradition. They don't even know about that liturgy. They don't know what it teaches. They don't know that that's where they come from and the beauty of it. They just become this Maronite who's in some way Roman Rite, or this Roman Rite person who's identifies as Maronite. It's almost is, in a weird way to say, to be quite negative on it, even though my view of this isn't actually necessarily that negative. And I'll go into this when I read one of the canons. It's almost a spiritual transgenderism. It can result in this spiritual transgenderism whereby you're identifying with that which you are not. And but I think, even though that's a negative, I think there's actually leeway that comes with the change in the canons. I want to read actually Canon 518, Book 2 from Canon Law, where it talks about, briefly talks about this, because I ages ago I wanted to have a look, and I can't remember specifically. I haven't done an in-depth look at all the canons to see what they necessarily say. I know there are some canons that talk about the fact that one ought to attend the parish that they're registered in. It doesn't even use that terminology. In fact, it actually emphasizes more so the obligation of your registered parish to give you that which you're due: last rites, communion, confession. Like, that can't be
Yeah.
resisted because I've changed parishes. But interestingly, so Canon 518, it says this: it says, as a general rule, a parish is to be territorial. That is, one which includes all the Christian faithful of a certain territory. When it is expedient, however, personal parishes are to be established, determined by reason of the right, language, or nationality of the Christian faithful of some territory,
Oh,
or even for some other reason. So I think there's something clear here in the Book of the People where it's talking about this. And this is actually not too, like, this is the updated canon, Canon 518. So what we see from this canon is something clear. It's not as strict as it used to be, in the sense of you had to attend your parish. Going off to another parish in actually all the rites wasn't seen as a good thing. In fact, in many instances, it wasn't even allowed. And this is still the case now, in the sense of I can't just rock up to some random parish and ask my child to be baptized there, or you can't do that. It has to
yeah,
be at your
that's true.
parish, etc. But what we do have now is a bit more leeway, and I think the leeway is there for a reason. However, when you reread that canon, it does say, going back to it again, when it's expedient, the personal parish, the parish you attend, it ought to have deference. It doesn't use that word. I'm adding that in there, but it can be inferred. It says to the right language or nationality of the Christian. A question. That's important. What that canon is still trying to enforce is that protection of patrimony. It's that example that was given before of, I think it was Leo, was it Pope Leo, who said that, who banned, who forbade, like made it an excommunicable offense for someone of the Roman Rite during the missionary days of Rome to forcefully convert or persuade a someone of the Eastern Rite to join the Roman Rite. Now,
Yeah.
it's not a sin. It's not a sin. It might be disordered in some way, perhaps, but it's not a sin for someone of their own volition to change rites. But for someone to convince them that they ought to, that's an excommunicable offense. And I think it still stands, but I'm not sure. But again, just going back to this canon, it's clear our patrimony has to be preserved. You're not sinning by going away and maybe attending a parish which isn't that of your own right. But this speaks to even more than just a liturgical loyalty. It speaks to a disposition of the soul, To abandon completely your patrimony, I would even make the case that it probably would be sinful to an extent. It's against the virtue of patriotism, it's against the virtue of prudence. It's not a good thing for you to abandon your lineage, to abandon your patrimony, not just liturgically, but even spiritually, to such an extent that you bastardize your right. You've you haven't done a good thing. At the same time, however, I think there is leeway. At the end of that canon, it does say or for any other reason. And I mean, before going into that, I'll let you speak more to, to what I've just said. But
Yeah. Um, so that one was in regards to Pope Leo XIII, was on Orientalium Dignitas, I think. It was condemning excommunication for any Roman Rite missionary who tries to persuade an Eastern Orthodox to become Roman Catholic, a Roman Rite Catholic. They had to be converted to the Eastern Catholic rites and their respective
yeah,
Eastern Catholic rites. So, if they were Byzantine, they should become Byzantine Catholic. If they were Syriac, they should become a Syriac Catholic. And that is because you have an obligation to your rite based on the fact that you received your sacraments from that rite. It's the same thing with your country. You don't love your country because it's the best country. Nobody can make that claim. Or if anybody could make that claim, only one out of the over 250 countries in the world can make that claim truthfully. So you know your love and the honor that you give your country, which is falls under the fourth commandment of honoring one's father and mother, which isn't just restricted to your biological parents, but towards any form of honor due or rendered towards a superior or your country, because you owe your country, not on account of it being the best, but on account that it's your country, that it's fed you, that it's raised you, it's given you rights, and you have an obligation to love it on that account. And the same thing is for any Catholic. If you are a Roman Rite Catholic, or you are a Maronite Catholic, or a Greek Catholic, you should love and feel obliged to that rite because it was your rite, that particular rite, that baptized you, confirmed you, gave you communion. And it's that cultural patrimony that you have to be immersed into. And so I was guilty of this. It's interesting when you read that canon as well. And you mentioned that it has some type of obligation to provide the sacraments, which was part of what instigated me, I think, because I personally moved away from attending the Maronite Rite for a while, for a good couple of years. It was a mix of things. At that time, I needed a really consistent confessor to overcome some vices, and I, because of my own circumstances, couldn't find that in my own right, and so I moved away for whatever reason and attended other rites. And I will still be defensive about how beneficial and edifying the Roman rite was to my spiritual life. And that's why I support people experiencing other rites, because I really think it makes you a better Catholic when you understand other traditions. I don't think I would be a better Catholic if I had ignorance of the Roman rite. I don't think ignorance is ever good. But the way I did it, I think, is reflective of the bad aspects of rite shopping, which is I stopped attending it. There was my own personal problems with my own rite that prevented me from, or that made me not want to attend my own rite. But when those problems waned away, I began to see, sometimes also from the advice of other Maronite priests who, because in Australia where we live, there's a very large Maronite community, and we overflow from our parishes into the surrounding parishes. So we become very active in the lives, the parish lives of not just the Maronite rite, but of the Roman rite. We go on we're part of the committees, we're employed by the diocese. So there's a very good spillover, which is excellent. But this is something that our priests have had to kind of I'm not the only person, to put it this way. We're not the only person in our diocese to have done this. And I remember speaking to somebody um, at an FSSP parish that I used to casually attend, who was a server there, and he was Maronite. And he told me that, a very holy monk that we both respected once told him that perfectly fine for him to go to the Latin Mass, serve the Latin Mass. But he said to him, "You're a Maronite, and once a week you should go to a Maronite Rite liturgy. Doesn't matter when in the week." And I think that really established a criteria that I don't even always live up to, but that that I think is the objective standard, which is ideally you should attend your rite for your Sunday liturgy. That is the ideal. But if you can't do that, or for whatever reason you don't do that, you should aim to go to your rite once a week, so that your visiting and immersion into other rites doesn't come at the detraction of your support to your own rite, but becomes something you do above and beyond. So you fulfilled your obligation in relation to your own rite. Now you want to attend another liturgy in the week, because this is to edify your own spiritual life. And so if we can start to see that the Sunday liturgy ought ideally to be the liturgy that we attend for our own rite, then we can kind of view our attendance at other rites to be for our own spiritual edification. Because for me, speaking from my own experience, the Roman Rite for a good couple of years edified my spiritual life liturgically, sacramentally, theologically, better than my own rite did. Just because it did it better for that time, because I think that was just a subjective thing. Where I was at in the spiritual life was met by the particular needs of my circumstances and my surroundings. Just because I might feel like another rite is better for me, even if it was objectively, I'm still fundamentally opposed to rite switching. I think that it is wrong to switch rites unless there is, like, I'm not saying this is a sinful thing, but I would never do it. Every person who's ever suggested it to me wanting to do it, I've opposed and actively convinced them against doing. And I think the only real exception to that is if you're becoming a priest. Because I think at that point you're making such a large enough sacrifice that you're entitled to do it in a manner in which, you know, you feel will help you in your vocation. But the bad side, I think, is when you start, just because you like another rite, that doesn't give you a right to attend it at the detraction of your own rite. So going to your another rite when you fail to attend your own rite is part of the bout of rite shopping. So I would say, yeah, right, attend other rites, learn other rites, but don't do it at the detraction of your own rite, because you do have an obligation to your own rite. That's the first part. The second part, I would say, is that you are going by default to be attracted to other rites, because, like, for me, being a 16-year-old at the time, not now, but at the time, having been predominantly attending Maronite liturgies up until the age of 16, to be immersed into another tradition was a new thing to me. And so the Roman Rite had an appeal of novelty. But after a period of time, that novelty will wear off, and you will begin to crave what is originally yours, which is another reason why you shouldn't switch rights, because nearly every person who has, at a later stage, begins to feel the call back to their original right, because the novelty will wear off. And then you can view both rights as equals, and you will always have a deference to the right that raised you. So, so that's what I'd say about that. And that sense of novelty came with me being somebody who was raised attending as a young child 3 different liturgical rites, going to the Maronite rite 3 Sundays a month, and the Melkite rite on the 4th Sunday, and going to a Roman rite parish by the time I was 16, I was familiar with those three rites. And then I learned the Latin Mass and then the Dominican rite, Latin Mass. So those were 5 liturgical rites that enriched my spiritual life. But at no point in that immersion of those rites should those ever come at the detraction of your original rite. And that's something I've learned now. And I think that any Roman rite doing the equivalent thing to the Eastern rites, or any other Eastern Catholic who feels maybe that the youth at another Eastern Catholic rite is more vibrant, that doesn't, in my opinion, give you the right. You know, if you're a Melkite and you enjoy hanging out with the Maronite parishes, you still have an obligation to attend your Maronite parishes. And I know a Melkite who does this, who will attend 2 liturgies on a Sunday, in the morning to the Melkite rite and then the evening youth mass at the Maronite rite, so that he could embrace the good aspects he sees in another rite, which is a thriving youth group, but he's always got a foot in his parish. And I think that's the commendable attitude on how to approach it. So that's what I have to say.
Yeah, well, I agree with a lot of what you said, definitely, and also just speaking just quickly on that aspect of rights, where we don't have a right to go to another right. I mean, in the technical sense, per the canons, we have a right to, but just because we have a right to something doesn't mean it ought to be exercised, used, and it also doesn't mean that we're using it in the right way. We see this with Vatican II, which really put an emphasis on trying to revitalize Eastern traditions. We see this without getting into current pontificate situations with the papacy and the Pope's push with certain Syro Malabar rites and what he's trying to do there. Not getting into it, but the point is the traditions of the respective rites ought to be preserved. We see Rome trying to do that with the East and trying to encourage it historically and even now. What this means is that when we see these change in the canons that allow us to actually attend different parishes validly, we have a right to do that, and parishes of a different rite specifically. But that doesn't mean that just because, like you said, there's an element of novelty or attraction, we should just move to a different parish. I don't think that's sufficient. I wouldn't say it's necessarily sinful, but I don't think it's rightly ordered. And so I think
Mm.
what ought to be done is you can experience the other rites, you can see the beauty in them, but there has to be a loyalty to one parish, and that parish, in almost all circumstances, should be the parish of your right. Now, if you're living somewhere where there's no parish of your right, you don't have a choice. You have to attend whatever parish is close to you. That's obviously a different situation. But novelty and attraction, I don't think, can be a reason to move parishes. I think if you're considering that, you ought to, at the very least, have a set period of time where you're consistently involved in and participating in your rite by birth, the Maronite rite, the Byzantine rite, the Roman rite. I think the only exception to this, in my opinion, and I'll lead into what I mean by here, would be abuse and scandal, especially in the context of having a family. If your rite happens to, well, ironically, not be true to its rite, in the sense of it being scandalous, not celebrating things reverently, there being heresy involved, these types of things, then there is a sense in which, in the order of virtues, in the order of how we're meant to structure our spiritual life and the catering of the lives of our families, that there is a calling to then move somewhere where you are being fed and your children are being fed. That's a different question. In that case, I think there is a leeway to attend a parish. Again, it's preferably still the parish of your same rite, but in the instance where you can't find that with proximate to your location, one where it's feasible and prudential to be able to do, I do think that attending a rite that isn't your own, so long as they're feeding you, is fine. With this exception, you still try to educate your family. Not even try, you still do educate your family and yourself in the non-family context of your patrimony. Doing things that allows you to maintain that tradition and patrimony of your rite is essential. If the Jesus prayer is a part of your rite as an Easterner, then you should be praying that. You should be studying and reading about your works. You even should be speaking about it in a way that's positive. Even if your experience is negative in that rite, you shouldn't be trashing your rite to other people
Mm.
and and making it look bad. Even in situation, it can be like an example can be used is with your family. You can have family members that are abusive or whatnot. Your father could be abusive, but that doesn't mean you trash him publicly. You don't detract from his character. There can be reasons why you're no longer associated, but you never
Mm,
detract. And so I think, again, via the canons, we have a right, in a sense. There's nothing prohibiting us via canon law to attend a different parish of a different rite. That doesn't mean we should, though. And so I think precaution should be had. Just because you like something or you think something is more edifying in the external sense, oh, you like these hymns, you like this liturgy, you feel more at home here. I don't think that's necessarily a valid enough reason. I think you have to have enough reason that had you not attended that parish of a different rite, your spiritual life would be at jeopardy. There's a
mm,
serious, tangible negative impact. If that isn't there and you are attending a different rite, or again, if I'm not talking about again situations where your rite isn't literally doesn't exist in proximity to your location, but again, if there's no tangible negative impact, you really should not be just abandoning your rite. There's no reason to. And at that point, I would even argue, not knowing if this is necessarily correct, but there is an element of sin there. I think there could be an element of sin at the very least. Well, I wouldn't say it's mortal, but venial, in the sense of you're abandoning something which is beautiful, which is good, and which, by all means, Rome has been encouraging you to do the opposite of what you're doing, abandoning your right. They've been encouraging a revitalizing of the tradition. It's important those traditions are preserved. Letting traditions die out on your account simply because of novelty and attraction, it's objectively not a good thing.
mm. I think that there's maybe one or two things I would slightly disagree with. So the first would be um, kind of the way you mentioned that if you give your parish a shot. So I feel the approach you have, which is legitimate, which is you're viewing yourself wanting to be committed to your own right in the parish, and you're going to give it your best shot. And you're going to be all in, be highly committed to it, and if it fails, then you kind of have the justification to move out, move to another parish, and establish yourself there. Now, I've always been a little bit less stable where I attend than you. You've always been rather dedicated. You're at this parish, this is the parish you go to, and then, okay, problem arises, you have to move, you move, and then there is this kind of, I think in your mind, or the way you've expressed it, a threshold that you've passed which justifies your right to have to move to a different liturgical rite for the time being. And then it's like a clear move. You go from 100% in, 100% out. Well, for me, because even when I'm consistent, I'm always attending multiple parishes. So I have my Sunday and a Maronite rite, my maybe a Monday mass at this particular parish to see this priest, a Wednesday mass to see at another Roman Rite parish to see this particular priest. Even when I'm consistent in a rotation. I would say that the difference I would have is I would still view it in a way that even if there is a need to expose yourself or your family to another rite, this shouldn't it shouldn't be a complete severance. There should maybe, in my opinion, maybe it needs to become a rotation. Like, sure, if you're talking about children, it might be hard to apply the rule of Sunday at your parish and then go to another mass for whatever is lacking that you think is lacking that you can gain somewhere else. So if that's not plausible because it's hard to get children to go to 2 liturgies a week, then maybe a rotation system would be better. I think all that I'm like this different on is that I don't view it as, you've got to try your best, be 100% committed. If you hit a threshold where you need to move, you move, and then there's like a clear cut move. I like if I was, God willing, one day when I have a family, if I was in a similar situation, I think maybe I would try to rotate it fortnightly so that I still keep my family in that And the only
I
reason I
actually
would
I
say
agree with that. I agree with that, but like just to butt in quickly, I think that maybe just to clarify any misunderstanding is that I don't necessarily think there's a threshold that just exists, but I think there is a matter of when one's faith is being negatively impacted, not in a subjective sense, but in a tangible, objective way, when things that ought to be done per that right aren't being done, and even maybe even seeking counsel with this and trying to fix those things even. But when that isn't being done, I think there is a sense in which one ought to make a decision objectively about whether staying in that parish is actually ordering their relationship to God properly. This can't be a
mm,
subjective thing. Just because the liturgy isn't being celebrated in the most traditional way, I don't think that's a reason. Just because the homilies aren't good, I don't even necessarily think that's a reason either. Just because you don't like the people there, I also don't think that's a reason. But I think when, for example, in situations of heresy, perhaps in situations of abuse, in situations where the liturgy is celebrated in such a way that is so unedifying that you can't properly participate, and there is no other parish of that respective right proximate
mm,
to you, I think there is then a tangible reason, perhaps, to move and maintain the patrimony of your right via other means. And
okay.
if other means a rotation, that's a good thing. But if that can't be done, then I don't think there is necessarily a reason to expect people to maintain a relationship with a particular parish as
Yeah,
if that means a relationship with your right. I think they can, in a way, be distinguished.
fair enough. I don't dispute that. I think if the parents, if the father or the mother agree that even going fortnightly because of the particular circumstance of the parish is problematic, then I think they're entitled to make that judgment. I'm not going to dispute that in itself. I think, yeah, as long because I was just getting the impression that it kind of felt like you've got to give it your best shot, and if it doesn't work, just 100% all out, as opposed to maybe trying to make up for it by doing a fortnightly thing. Because the only reason I say this is like when God willing, if I have children, young children, um, there is so much that is instilled in a young child through what they just observe continuously for years, that the reason why as a Maronite I could fall so deeply in love with the Roman Rite but still have something that after a period of time calls me back is because when something is ingrained in your childhood memory, it instills a deep nostalgia. And might be a psychological effect, but I think when we know that that's an effect that we can, as parents, create in a child, then it can kind of be used in a good way in the sense that, you know, especially when a kid is maybe so young that the quality of the homily makes no difference because they can't comprehend it, that what will be more important is just them feeling that their particular right is home. Like instilling in the mind of the children from a young age that this is the default of liturgy for you because you are that right. So when a kid is really young, you really want them for a longer period of time to feel that more than not, because again, when I was a child, I wasn't every Sunday at a Maronite Rite. It was 3 times out of 4, yes, but once out of 4 was a Melkite liturgy. So, but because the Maronite Rite was still more than 50% of the liturgies I went to, it remained in my consciousness as the default liturgical rite. And I would say this is just a psychological point of a negative of heavily rite shopping is if you've got young kids, you will, let's say you're a Melkite Catholic who just attends the Roman Rite all the time. When your child is of an age of reason and attends the Melkite liturgy, which is their liturgy by birth and by baptism, that's not going to feel like home to them. That's going to feel like something different. And their heart will always yearn for what they were
That's
raised
a
with.
good point.
And so I would want my kids to be raised in the Maronite liturgy so that they have that yearning to always go back to it the way I do. Because if I didn't, then what would have pulled me back? Except for it just being like a brute force intellectual, you must do this out of a sense of obligation, in which, yeah, sure, you could do it. But Um, just that's just a point of consideration. So just to keep them in that familiar waters, so that one day when they're old enough and you present them with their own right, it's not something different. It's home. It's what they love. It's what they've grown up with, and it's not going to be treated like a novelty.
And I definitely agree with what you've said. I think it just has to be clear to people that it's there is an obligation, perhaps not a formal one, but there is an obligation to preserve your traditions, to preserve your culture. Just in the same way people in political context try and make arguments to preserve their cultures and identity, why is that not then the same in religion? Why is that not then the same in the Catholic faith? Well, it is. It is the same. There is an obligation, and it falls under, like you said, there's an element of that commandment of honoring your father and mother that extends beyond your biological parents, but those who gave you the patrimony from which you came. And so that has to be preserved. There are leeways, there are exceptions. It's nuanced in a way, but it still stands. There's an objective fact. You ought to preserve your traditions, and that people may not like it. And I may struggle with that as well, but that does take its form in the liturgy. The liturgy is the peak of the spiritual life. The liturgy perfectly, lex orandi, lex credendi, reflects our patrimonies and our traditions, our theological expressions in
Well,
certain ways. And so the liturgy is an important part of that. If that can be done, it ought to be done. It's a necessity in a sense.
and I would kind of want to lead it into this real quick. This is probably the last real point I'd have, um, because for me, the bad turns ugly when you abandon. The ugly is when you reject your own right and embrace another tradition without due reason. That's the ugly. Um, but for me, it's an actual genuine argument in favor of the Catholic Church as the true church, because it's the only church that does not require anybody to reject their cultural patrimony. Not cultural patrimony, even, but the obligation that they have to their particular tradition. So, if I, for example, wanted to become Oriental Orthodox, I'm going to have to embrace an Alexandrian or an Ethiopian or think Armenian, an Armenian tradition. I think they're Oriental Orthodox, and I'm going to have to embrace somebody else's tradition and the fathers and preserve only a particular form of the faith. While if I were to become Eastern Orthodox, I would have to embrace either the Greek patrimony or the Russian patrimony or the Bulgarian patrimony or the Antiochian patrimony. But I would say that only in the Catholic Church is nobody required to reject their patrimony, because it is only in the Catholic Church that every true apostolic branch of Christianity has a home, such that you don't need to reject the fathers of the Alexandrian Church or of the Armenian Church or of the Greek Church or of the Roman Rite or of the Syriac tradition. And now I think, after having discussed so much, the sense of obligation that you as a Christian has, because it's surprisingly um, a very strong power. Like, Eastern Orthodox will complain about this a lot, that they don't actually know if they could ever really have mass conversions in America, because they say that the Western patrimony is so ingrained in these people that for them to move to the Eastern patrimony, it's so foreign to them that so few of them are capable of doing, that when they come at the crossroads between Catholicism or Orthodoxy, they often choose Catholicism based on cultural reasons. And we could just, argue the theology all day, but there's a genuine thing there. If we are actually making a case that there is a genuine obligation that you have towards your own right, because it is through your lineage, it is through a particular form of Christianity that the faith has come to you, then only Catholicism can make the claim that it can embrace all people. All people can come to it without having to reject their patrimony. And so Catholicism is the only right that allows everybody to maintain that natural precept without having to violate it. You don't have to reject the Western tradition to become Catholic. You don't have to reject the Alexandrian school, the Antiochian schools. Sure, you'll have to reject certain corrupt elements that have come into every tradition, but you don't have to abandon the rights of your father and his father's father so that you can embrace the true faith. And I think that's a genuine, if you're making a case for Catholicity, I think that in that regard, no other branch of Christianity can even go near making that claim of Catholicity.
Definitely, definitely. It is an obligation to preserve your right. I think to end this, since we're hitting the 1 hour and 30-minute mark, I'd like to end it with a quote from Pope Leo the 13th encyclical, the Orientalium Dignitas. He has a very brief quote, which I think is a good way to end it. And so I'll read that to end it. He says that the Catholic Church does not possess one rite only, but that she embraces all the ancient rites of Christendom. Her unity consists not in a mechanical uniformity of all her parts, but on the contrary, in their variety, according in one principle, and vivified by it.